Hi, I am so delighted that you joined me in this video. So in this video, I will be demonstrating how to start a pine needle basket with a base.
For the base, I'll be using a wooden base with holes drilled around the edge to attach the pine needles. For my gauge, I'll be using a piece of straw with a 1/4 inch diameter. Commonly use this gauge size for making my baskets. For the stitch, it will be the straight width or straight V stitch. In this tutorial, I'll be using burgundy artificial sinew as my thread. For my baskets, I usually prefer one of the 5 plies of the artificial sinew because it gives a delicate and more balanced appearance. However, for better visibility in this tutorial, I'll be using a whole strand of artificial sinew. A single strand of artificial sinew can support up to 70 pounds, so we can safely use a single ply for a basket if we prefer.
But before watching this tutorial on how to start a pine needle basket with a base, I suggest that you read my post on pine needle baskets, a guide to materials and tools first, so that you gain a better understanding of the materials and tools required to create a pine needle basket.
I've watched several videos on how to start a pine needle basket and the techniques vary. It's possible that you'll find another method that suits you better, but here's what works for me. I usually begin with 7 pine needles in the gauge. To make it easier to hide the pine needles later on under the overlapping row of the basket, I stagger the tail of each pine needle. Now attach the pine needles to the base and begin stitching. Identify the best side of your base to begin the basket. I usually prefer starting my pine needle basket in a location where it won't be apparent later on.
So for this basket, I started it on the left bottom side of the base.
For our basket base in this tutorial, the design is monotonous, so it doesn't matter where I start. To attach the pine needles to the base, I wrap the thread once in the first hole, leaving 2 inches long of the thread's end. Then, I insert the thread's end between the pine needles so that I can stitch it in. And then wrap one more time on the same hole to secure everything. You can try to tug the thread to check if it is no longer loose. Also, in pine needle basketry, we don't make knots in the basket. If we do, we should ensure they are hidden between the coils. Using waxed threads enhances the grip of the materials we're working with. For the next 2 holes, I refrain from adding any pine needles to the coil. I proceed with stitching using our preferred stitch, the straight V stitch. V stitch is one of the simplest stitches, and it's one of my go-to stitches to begin my basket. I'll create a separate post dedicated to my go-to stitches for starting a basket. The straight V-stitch consists of two parts, a vertical stitch and a simple stitch to the next hole. The third hole onward, I begin adding pine needles. I insert the pine needles up to the last stitch I made to ensure the consistent size of our coils throughout the basket. I insert the pine needle in the center of the coil to prevent any ends from sticking out. From the third hole onward, add 1 or 2 pine needles after every stitch until you achieve the desired thickness as determined by your gauge. To determine if you need to insert more pine needles, slide the gauge. If the gauge doesn't easily slide, it indicates that you've inserted enough needles. Conversely, if the gauge is loose, add more pine needles. The gauge's purpose is to ensure uniform coil thickness throughout the basket. It's crucial to hold the thread at the back of the base while adding pine needles to prevent the basket from loosening. Additionally, don't hesitate to tug the thread slightly as you make each stitch to tighten the coil. We typically use a single type of stitch in a row for simplicity and a cleaner look for the basket. However, you can be as creative as you desire. As a member of my Patreon, you're entitled to a 10% discount on my Etsy products using our discount code for the month. Please refer to my post monthly discount codes. These bases and thread are available on my Etsy.
They're also available on Amazon, eBay, Walmart, but the 10% discount code, you can only use it on my Etsy shop. My Etsy shop is called Distinctive You.
So at this point, I might not add more pine needles because the tails will compensate for the ones I should be adding in the coil. However, I ensure I have enough pine needles to conceal the tails of the initial pine needles. When I reach the tips of the first pine needles of our coil, I occasionally cut them to create a more staggered effect, making it easier to conceal them neatly under the coil for a more aesthetically pleasing basket. Now you can observe that the tails are tucked neatly under the coil. When you reach the hole where you began, you'll decide whether to continue with the same stitch. Looking at the basket now, I prefer to continue with the straight V stitch. So, for the next row, we create a new hole by poking the vertical stitches of the first row. This method continues until I change the type of stitch I'll use. So there you have it. I hope this post has guided you through the process of starting a pine needle basket. If you have any questions, feel free to post them as comments on this post or send it to 10kmilesllc@gmail.com. I'll do my best to answer them or compile them into a separate topic for future reference.
I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.